Welcome back for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. I'm Eric Mills, Editor-in-Chief of Naval History Magazine. Glad to join you again. It's the cusp of April, May in the year of 2025. And right now we're remembering what happened 50 years ago at this very time as the long and demanding Vietnam War was winding down. And more than 1,842,000 men and women of the U.S. Navy served in Southeast Asia. And as the Vietnam experience taught us, it was quite a thing to go through, and anybody who did remembers it to this day well. And I think a lot of them are thinking about it right now at the half-century mark. The Navy's involvement ended quite heroically 50 years ago, right when we're speaking, as Saigon fell faster than anybody expected, and the Navy's Operation Frequent Wind remarkably and heroically managed to evacuate thousands upon thousands of American personnel and refugees from the fall of Saigon to those communist forces. This was a remarkable event of the Navy in the Vietnam War, and it closes the war. So it's very much in our memories right now. And here to talk us through all that is Ed Offley, our 2023 Naval History Author of the Year. Welcome back, Ed. It's great to see you.
Thanks, Eric. Great to be here.
Wonderful. Well, Ed has given some great coverage to this on digitally. You can go to our website and read a couple of articles from him about this. It's quite a story, and I recommend you go there if you haven't yet. So, Ed, let's talk about this and what a Herculean task this was, and a scramble, and how quickly it had to unfold. It's a quite amazing thing.
The thing I found fascinating is that every embassy in the world has an evacuation plan ongoing, updated all the time. I believe the only two times in recent history that it was actually carried out were again Saigon and then in Mogadishu in 1991, when that country fell into chaos. But what happened, two things that made the evacuation a lot hairier than it would have been on paper, were that the South Vietnamese regime disintegrated, where in the last 4 months of its existence, it was falling apart like a house of cards. The main reason, and I don't have the complete mastery of the explanation of it, was that the South Vietnamese army did not believe in what they were doing. And from the beginning of the final push in late 1974, they ran away, they crumbled, they didn't even fight back. And a couple of weeks into that, then President Van Thieu made an historically horrible decision, although maybe there were no good decisions to make. He ordered his big four army divisions in the central and northern part of the country to leave and come south and surround Saigon as a final defensive perimeter. Well, they left their positions and disintegrated and fled, and only a handful of smaller units ever made it the several hundred miles down to where Saigon was. So suddenly, I keep pronouncing his name, the head of North Vietnam ordered his general, Van Thien Dung, to move as fast as he could to just capture the rest of the country. They had estimated it would take 2 or 3 years to do it. It took them 130 days from the kickoff of the offense, because the South just stopped fighting. And I'll let other historians try to untangle that mystery. So the U.S. Evacuation plan was in effect, but it called for using, at the beginning, civilian airports, commercial airlines, to get these designated critical Vietnamese employees, people who were earmarked for prison or a firing squad once the communists took over. The thought was they just fly away to other countries. Well, within a matter of weeks, the only major airport left that was working was Tan Son Nhut, the international airport right in Saigon. So they had to quickly retool, and that's when I believe it was Noel Geiler, the admiral in charge of Pacific Command, and Maurice Wisner, the vice the Pacific Fleet commander, uh, ordered Task Force 76 to sea. This was the 7th Fleet's amphibious strike arm. And to that, they added 3 aircraft carriers, the Hancock, the helicopter carrier Okinawa, and the USS Midway. And what they did was they got every amphibious ship with a helipad. I think there were 28 in all, plus escorts and auxiliaries. And they staged about 70 miles south of the southern Vietnamese coast as the last ditch haven for refugees coming out of Saigon by helicopter. Meanwhile, they, organizing this effort, I'll use the Midway as an example. She got underway from Yokosuka on the last day in March and was just a day out at sea doing routine exercises when she got the orders to take part in frequent wind. And Captain Larry Chambers, the CO, he'd only been commanding officer for a month. This is his baptism of fire. He was ordered to sprint south to Okinawa and pick up 2 helicopter squadrons, 2 Marine helo squadrons, and ferry them to transfer at sea to the Hancock. The Hancock and the Midway were essentially taken out of the carrier strike air power role and made into helicopter platforms like the rest of the amphibs. Chambers later admitted that he wasn't too happy about it, but it turned out to be a pretty exciting experience anyway. So then the Midway proceeded to Subic Bay, offloaded most of its air wing and 500 of its air wing personnel to make room for the anticipated refugees, and then steamed across the South China Sea and took up station with this Task Force 76. You know, I had the unique double opportunity this year to both be on the Midway in person, and it means much to me because, as I'll show you, I served on her for 2 years right after her recommissioning in 1970. So it was like a ultimate reunion. I was there for a history seminar in February. And then just last week, the Naval Aviation Museum over in Pensacola, about an hour and a half from my house, held an amazing reminiscence ceremony in which the flight of the bird dog was honored. And we'll get to that in a minute. But what happened was they were making these plans, doing the best they could. I was most impressed with an account on what the Midway did. They had very little guidance from the State Department or anyone else as to what to expect, although they were anticipating a very large number of frightened civilians and children who had never seen a ship or never been on a helicopter to suddenly be dumped out at sea on this inferno of a flight deck during flight operations. But one of the things they realized, they anticipated, and somebody smart in their air wing did, was that a lot of UH-1 Huey helicopters, the kind used by the Army for troop transport, were going to be flying out because that's what the Vietnamese Air Force had. And one thing about Hueys is they don't have wheels. So if you land a Huey and you turn it off and you can't turn it on again, it's dead weight on the deck. You can't move it or tow it or anything. So they got the idea to build these little, kind of like a miniature steel girder with wheels. And then they could get 5 or 6 sailors to hang on to the rear of the Huey, by the rotor, tilt it up. They'd slide these things under and then let the helo back down, and then they could tow it out of the way. If they had not come up with this ad hoc invention, it would have been chaos and probably a disaster on the ship, because the number of Vietnamese helicopters that essentially were commandeered, stolen, whatever, anyone who could fly one grabbed one and took off. They'd land, the crews would turn them off. They usually had about 4 or 5 minutes of gasoline left anyway. And then they'd walk away and get in line to be processed as refugees. They didn't even have air crews to fly them. So because of that, they call it channel iron, because of the little wheel assemblies, they were able to, I believe it was over 50 Hueys were recycled back into our service. So anyway, the other thing that complicated the evacuation from Saigon was the ambassador himself, Graham Martin. He was a very proud man, a very, very proud, actually, FDR, deal Democrat. but he was working for Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford at the time. And he decided he was going to be tougher than anyone. And he had this thing in his head that somehow Saigon and Hanoi could still negotiate some sort of a settlement that would allow for a coalition government. And he was still believing this as there were about 15 North Vietnamese army divisions encircling the city, getting ready to just, crunch through the gates of the presidential palace. Well, as a result of his belief, he flatly refused to let the evacuation plan begin until he was finally ordered directly by Ford to start the evacuation plan. And that's why it didn't happen until late afternoon or mid-afternoon on the 29th. They were ready to go, 15, 20 hours earlier. And because of that, most of the evacuation flights were in darkness, which just added a whole other element of potential danger to the mission.
Yeah, I was intrigued by that in reading your piece. His recalcitrance in the face of reality. I mean, the North Vietnamese army is surrounding North Vietnam. Why would North Vietnam remotely care about a coalition government at that point? They won. It's checkmate. And the way he just continues to cling to that is a little maddening when you read it now, 50 years later.
I know. And the issue of the tamarind tree is one that made me both laugh and kind of groan internally. The embassy in Saigon was about a 4-acre plot, had trees and, landscaping. But there's this huge parking lot right out the front of the building. But there's this huge tree in the middle of it to give shade to the parked cars. And the Marine Security Force said, we need to cut that tree down because that's where the heavy CH-53 helicopters are going to have to land. And he refused to let the tree cut down, saying, hey, if that tree comes down, our country's prestige will be gone. And it took a deadly rocket attack on Tan Son Nhut Airport that sadly killed 2 Marine security guards, the last 2 combat deaths in the Vietnam War, before he finally had some reason knocked into him and allowed them to remove the tamarind tree. But anyway, the evacuation was chaotic. They were officially expecting about 500 or 600 Vietnamese at the embassy, while the rest of them would go out to what they called the Defense Attaché compound at Tan Son Nhut. This was the former headquarters for guys like General Westmoreland and Abrams. It had been taken over by a very small staff of 50 attachés and advisors who, under the Paris Peace Accords, were allowed to operate there, training and provisioning the South Vietnamese. But there are also about 1,200 civilian employees involved and 4,000 or 5,000 Vietnamese. So the plan for the evacuation was to leave out of Tan Son Nhut Airport. But at 3:30 in the morning on the 29th, the North Vietnamese Army unleashed this huge rocket attack that cratered the runway, destroyed a bunch of aircraft, and killed a bunch of people, including these 2 poor security guards. So suddenly, the only way out of Saigon was through the embassy. And instead of having 400 or 500 people there, instead of that, they had several thousand, with thousands more in the streets trying to climb over this 10-foot high wall to somehow get out of the country. I cannot express enough how amazed I was at the way that this very small Marine security guard staff was able to keep the place in order amidst this panic and chaos. They did an amazing job up until the very end, when they had to evacuate themselves from the front of the building, into the building, up the stairs, onto the roof to wait for their helicopter out. So it was 18 hours of controlled chaos. The loss of life was just incredibly small, except for the 2 security Marines killed at the airport. One of the helicopters at sea, CH-46, it was not in the evacuation mission at that moment. It was doing just a routine patrol, looking for either threats on the water or small fishing boats that needed rescuing. And it had a mishap and crashed into the sea, killing the 2 pilots. The 2 air crewmen did survive, though. Amazing, just.
I was putting myself in that place of being at the embassy, wondering, am I going to get out? And the whole world's just blowing up around you. it's just like you say, it's controlled chaos, barely controlled chaos. But the logistical accomplishment of this was the main takeaway to me. It's just miraculous what they pulled off, and the fact they have to improvise landing methods on the fly as they go. It just speaks incredibly to the professionalism in the face of like a flood of adversity that they were able to pull this thing off. And as you say, it was 18 hours.
Yeah,
Remarkable,
I
remarkable
think the
thing.
total number of helicopter sorties, and that was like almost an hour each way, 45, 50 minutes to get to from the ships into Saigon, load up, and then another hour back. The whole time there's stray rounds going up in the air. The 60 helicopters in the official mission, there were 50 Marine helos and these 10 Air Force search and rescue CH-53s on the Midway. They flew over 630 sorties. It's about, I don't know, about 10 per helicopter. The Air Force guys were obviously pros. These were the helicopters that went into enemy airspace to rescue shot down pilots and stuff. The search and rescue mission. I had a very close friend who had served in that unit, and he said every day was the most exciting day you'd ever want to have. They had never, though, landed on a carrier or done night carrier landing, and they didn't have time or the fuel to rehearse. Captain Chambers later said he was cursing his luck that, he had these huge, for people who have not seen a CH-53, it looks like a Greyhound bus with a rotor. They're absolutely huge. 10 of them completely filled the Midway's 4-acre flight deck. You normally see 85 or 90 jets all with their wings folded up, tucked in. Well, these things were just like reaching out with these big rotors and ate up the whole space. But they carried out their mission flawlessly, and my hat's off to them.
Amen to that. Roger that. Yeah, there's a photo of that. You actually found it for us. That is on one of Ed's articles. So when you read that, folks, you'll see this amazing shot of the Midway. No aircraft, no Navy aircraft on the flight deck, just these 10 massive choppers doing this amazing job. Now, one of the most remarkable stories of this was not a chopper. It was a little old Cessna. Let's talk about this. Like you say, 50 years later, this remains a remarkable sea story. I will leave it to you to have the honor of telling it.
I had the honor of watching the two key characters in that story tell their story. That was the honor for me. The official frequent wind evacuation ended like right at sunrise on the 30th of April. And the ships at sea were processing thousands. I believe the Midway would ultimately end up with about 3,500 refugees getting out of helicopters, going down below, getting processed. And then they would transfer them to other ships to be taken to places like the Philippines and Guam. But on the morning of the 30th, the thing got crazier than ever, because now you had scores of Vietnamese Air Force airplanes and helicopters just fleeing the country, looking for any place at sea to land on. They were ignoring radio transmissions. Captain Chambers on the Midway said that the only thing they could communicate with was by Aldous lamp, showing them green, which is okay to land, or red, keep away. At one point in the morning, he recounted there were at least 32 Hueys hovering over the ship, waiting for their opportunity to slam down on the flight deck. Meanwhile, I have to back up and tell you a human part of this drama that I found fascinating. It has to do with leadership and the chain of command. When Larry Chambers and his crew left Yokosuka on March 31st, their admiral was aboard, Rear Admiral William L. Harris Jr., a former commander of the Midway. He was the commanding officer in 71, 72. 50 years after the fact, these gentlemen spoke a little more candidly than they would normally in the wardroom, on active duty. And essentially, they let it be known this Admiral Harris was not a very nice man to work for. He was essentially very negative, always interfering, always countermanding orders, always getting his feet involved in parts of operating the ship that was really up to Captain Chambers. So anyway, he was on board when they left Yokosuka. But on the second day, they got a message transferring the Midway to the command of Task Force 76, former All-America and Annapolis All-American lineman named Don Whitmire, now a senior rear admiral in the 7th Fleet. So suddenly, this know-it-all busy bee carrier group commander is just a VIP passenger. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have anything to do with Operation Frequent Wind. And yet he kept badgering and pestering poor Captain Chambers and his air staff and everyone else he came into contact with. So fast forward to 30 April 1975, in the middle of this chaos of descending helicopters and red Aldous lamps, this O-1 Cessna bird dog, U.S. Army markings on it, comes flying into the range of the Midway, starts circling around, and they can't reach comms with him. As it turned out, the aircraft radio microphone was missing. Somebody had taken it, and so they had no way to contact or talk to each other. But he circles and circles with his landing lights on, which universally means I want to land. Chambers looks out, and he's got a flight deck full of Vietnamese helicopters and nobody to move them. So in the midst of this, the pilot, whose name was Major Bung Lee, L-Y, manages to write a note and on a little deck card that you have on your knee showing radio frequencies, and stuffs it into his pistol holster. And it's the third time he's tried to leave a message. He sweeps over the ship and drops his holster onto the deck. Seamen grab it. They run up to the bridge. And it's now one of the more famous exhibits on the USS Midway Museum. It says, "I can fly one more hour. Please rescue me, Major Bung Lee, wife, and 5 child." So they were in a 2-seat airplane with 5 very small children. Chambers' lookouts could tell there was more than 2 people in the plane. At this point, Mr. Admiral, with nothing much to do, starts barking orders at him to turn the Midway into a sharp wake to create a calm swath of water in its lee and allow the plane to ditch. And Chambers himself, then and now, knew that that would be a death sentence for some, if not all, of the people on the plane. And he turned to his admiral and he said, "Sir, this is my ship and it's my decision." So he turned to his air boss, Commander Vernon Jumper, and said, I want a ready flight deck for that airplane. There's about a dozen Hueys sitting where the resting cables are. Apparently, what Vernon Jumper said to Larry Chambers cannot be printed even 50 years later. But
by us.
Chambers got on the 1MC and said, "Everybody not on duty, I need volunteers to come up and push some helicopters over the side." And in amazement, 1,000 of his crew came running up on deck and started shoving helicopters over the side. At this point, Larry Chambers was convinced that he was going to be court-martialed, for, I don't know, littering, I don't know. and so they got the ready deck clear set, and 8 more helicopters landed. So they had to do it all over again. And at this point, he said, "What's another 8 helicopters to my court-martial? It's not going to make any difference."
Right.
So they finally got the deck cleared. He put the Midway at 25 knots with a 15-knot wind, which gave Major Lee 40-knot wind over the deck. And he comes in, it's raining, little airplane bounces and bounces and stops, and is surrounded by hundreds of sailors who are cheering his immense bravery and, desperation too, I guess. So I've seen video, there are snatches of it on the internet, on YouTube and other places. If you go search for Midway and Operation Frequent Wind, you see this incredibly wiry young Vietnamese Air Force major and his wife and a bunch of infants and babies being handed down from their airplane. What you don't see is the best part of the story. He was taken up to the navigation bridge where Captain Chambers shook his hand, took off his own wings of gold, pinned them on Major Lee's flight suit, and said, "You're now an honorary naval aviator." Well, last week I finally got to hear Major Lee's side of the story. They had this commemorative ceremony at the Naval Aviation Museum over in Pensacola. And both Captain Chambers, who's an incredible 96 now and looks not a day over 65, and Major Lee and his family both came and gave amazing reminiscences about that crazy day in April 1975. And I did not know this. I learned a bunch of new stuff from him. He was, there was an air base, excuse me, on a place called Con Son Island, which I had never heard of. It was about 40 miles off the coast of the mainland. Apparently, in addition to an Air Force base, there was a huge prison. And this is where South Vietnamese kept all their North Vietnamese POWs. And what Major Lee realized on the morning of April 30th was that the guard force at that prison were doing what the Vietnamese army and the government and everyone else had been doing. They were quietly just melting away into the background. And he was terrified that the prisoners were going to break out and murder everybody on the island who wasn't one of them. And so he somehow got his family onto the base and got that plane and headed out. And he said he had no idea if he was going to even find a ship to land on when he left, but there was nowhere else to go. So he being a trained aviator, had learned his flight skills in the United States earlier in the war, has a very good sense of English and a very good sense of humor. And he said he went flying out there just following everybody else. And he got out and he found the Midway and he looked down, he could see a bunch of helicopters on the deck. And he said, well, I guess if they're gonna let them land, they'll let me land too. Without being able to talk to the ship or anything. But he managed to pull it off. And he later confided to Captain Chambers that there was no other option. If they continued to not let him, show the red light, he was going to crash land on it, because that was the next best option to trying to land on the ship. Ditching in the water would have been fatal.
What a remarkable story of survival. And a whole family survived, and the crew was elated. I feel like from reading your account, it seems like the whole crew felt collectively like we just saved the lives of this family, this young family. And there's this incredibly courageous father. And they more or less sort of adopted them, didn't they? They raised money to let them get to the States. Let's talk about that.
Well, one of the more eloquent people who spoke was a retired Navy captain named McElroy, who at the time of frequent wind was a second-class flight deck petty officer who later got his commission and became a captain himself. And he said the crew on the flight deck were so adamant that these people were not going to get in trouble, that a bunch of them said if for some reason he couldn't stop, they were going to run out and grab onto the plane and hold onto it themselves to keep it from going over the forward edge of the flight deck. But he said it was just a moment of elation in a very, very hard, bad day at the end of a very, very tragic war. And they collected $10,000, which, by the way, in 2025 dollars, that's about $60,000, and somehow got it to the family when they resettled in Florida. I got to tell you one story that wasn't in my article, because my article is already too long. But
No, it's just right.
Originally, they were going to just throw the bird dog over the side with like the Vietnamese helicopters, but Admiral, I can't remember his first name, Admiral Tuttle was the head of the Naval Aviation Museum at the time. And he heard about this and he immediately said, we need that airplane. We need that airplane. Unfortunately, it was an Army plane, U.S. Army plane in very good shape. Made it out and made a carrier landing after all. But good fortune prevailed, because Larry Chambers had a brother who was an Army officer on the staff of the Chief of Staff of the U.S. Army. And so Chambers contacted him and said, we got this old Army plane, but it's really beat up. It's in bad shape. I don't think you're going to want to use it for anything. Is it okay if we keep it? And the guy, talked to the general and he said, sure, no problem. And
really bad shape.
Smuggled it back to Pensacola, where it's hanging from the roof today.
That's fantastic. I just think that is amazing. You got to speak to these gentleman, because this is such a legendary account. It's the standout account everybody remembers of this event, and to be able to actually hear them tell the story, what a privilege that must have been.
Well, for a journalist, it's a real privilege, I tell you.
Yeah.
The deputy director of the museum said that the bird dog is one of the favorite stories that museum likes to tell of all the varied history. I mean, they have a whole section on the Midway and the Battle of Midway, and everything before, during, and after. But this is like the cherry on the parfait for them.
Yeah, I can see that. Well, it's very inspiring to see that now. It's a poignant kind of one little glimmer of a good story at the end of a long, tragic one, which was the Vietnam War experience. What do you think now that we're looking at this in retrospect, 50 years after? Lessons learned from that war have been talked about immensely and will continue to be. But the mood of the country in the wake of it was bad for like that first decade, was it not? The 70s was a feeling like we'd lost our sense of identity in the world at that point. It took a long time for us to get that back. Wouldn't you agree?
I had a kind of a personal realization myself. It was just about, it was 5 years afterwards. I have an article that you've been so kind to post about my long association with aircraft carriers.
Good one, yeah.
I found a strong connection to the USS Nimitz 5 years after this in 1980. I was working at the time. I'd been out of the Navy myself for about 8 or 9 years. I was a newspaper editorial page editor up in Central Virginia. When I read about the community in Norfolk was looking forward to hosting a major welcome home ceremony for the USS Nimitz and its two cruiser escorts who had been extended overseas because of the Iran hostage crisis. I think they'd been over 2 months at sea without even a port visit, and 8 or 9 months all in all deployment. And, I'd never really thought one way or the other about welcome home when I got out of the Navy. I mean, I was so glad to get back to what we called the world that I never looked back. But now I suddenly thought, well, I'm glad they're doing it for these guys. I'm sort of sorry they never did it for any of us. So I decided to go down and watch this return. And I was with the media pool. They flew us out. I was on the cruiser USS Texas coming in just ahead of the Midway. So I got a nice shot of the ship coming up channel. But when we turned into Hampton Roads, it was like a carpet of pleasure craft and boats and sailboats with thousands, hundreds of people, waving banners and saluting air horns and stuff. And I was standing next to this grizzled bosun's mate chief petty officer who looked like he could bend steel with his teeth. And he was just weeping for something he had expected never to happen to him. And that was the moment I realized that there is a reconciliation possible.
Mm-hmm.
So
it took some years, but I feel like that kind of outpouring of support for the Nimitz returning was almost like the public. It's like a catharsis for the public because of how things soured in terms of the public mood during Vietnam, and I feel like this country has felt a sense of regret about the returning troops from Vietnam pretty much ever since then.
Yeah, I know. I once asked a 3-star Army general what it had been like to come back from his first tour in Vietnam, and he burst into tears. I thought, sorry, I didn't mean to do that.
Yeah.
But it was just when they said, "Oh, you should take off your uniform and put on civilian clothes because there's going to be people throwing things at you in the terminal." I got a little irked by this, but maybe we were all a little stupid when we were younger. But the 1.8 million people who served in Vietnam were the victims of a policy that was fatally flawed from the start. And you want to go back and find blame, go back to the White House Situation Room, where even the Joint Chiefs of Staff were frozen out of Vietnam decisions. We used to say, "What are they going to do? Send me to Vietnam?" It's just maddening that they got mad at the wrong people. They were the
Mhm.
people in uniform were the easier targets, but hopefully we're beyond that now. I think we are.
Yeah, I think Desert Shield, Desert Storm was when America really put that finally in their rearview mirror.
Yeah.
We still have to relearn the hard lessons about when, where, and why, and do we really do this or not, and all that. We'll always have to revisit those bitter lessons. But I feel like the public, the Vietnam syndrome, as they called it, I think that kind of did end with Desert Shield, Desert Storm. Which again, it was very much of a catharsis for the public at the time, as I'm sure you recall. You were probably working as a journalist at that point.
I
Early
know. I
90s.
used to tell people I'm 2 for 2. I went to Vietnam in the Navy and I came home and everybody hated me. And I went to Desert Shield and Desert Storm as a reporter and I came home and everybody hated me.
Yeah, because you're the media. Said, wait a minute, no, I've been there. I'm different. Yeah. Well, it was really great to revisit these heroes who saved all these people. As you point out, South Vietnam fell just like caved. Nobody expected it to fall that quickly, so people were kind of caught off guard by this. And the fact that they were able to get so many people out is just such a remarkable feat, and it's something about which the Navy can be eternally proud, in my opinion. And thank you so much for bringing it to our readers, folks. If you haven't gone online to see these, you should definitely see it. There's 2 great articles. One covers the whole Operation Frequent Wind. The other talks specifically about the famous landing of the Bird Dog. And you're going to want to read this. It's a good way to remember this time and these people and what they did. And Ed, thank you as always for a great professional contribution to the content of the magazine. And God knows we'll be talking to you again. I'm sure you've got other things coming up for us soon, so we'll be watching for that, and I'm sure we'll talk again.
Very good.
Meanwhile, sorry the pollen's so high there in Florida, but it's pretty bad here too, honestly. Judging from the sun behind you, it's a sunny day here, but it looks like it's like really, really sunny where you are.
They keep telling us it's going to rain and then it doesn't. So we've been on the edge of all of that. So I keep hacking.
Well, best of luck with that. And thanks again for joining us. It's always a pleasure, Ed.
My pleasure. Talk to you soon.
Take care. We'll talk to you again soon. That's it for us, folks. Thanks for joining us for another Naval History edition of the Proceedings Podcast. Until next time, fare thee well and read history, learn from it, and think about it. Farewell.